Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Zooming with Hawks using digital courseware in a hybrid environment. Our speaker today is Professor Nick Brittin from Lake Michigan College. Professor Brittin is an English instructor there and functions as the chair of the Communications and Foreign Language Department. His research primarily focuses on post-structural analysis of literature and classical arguments in composition. In addition, he is currently exploring integrating new technologies in the classroom, both in hybrid and traditional environments, and he is considering ways to add virtual and augmented reality to the learning experience. We are excited that Professor Brittin is here to share his vast experience and insight with us today. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A box at that time, and we will address them at the end of the talk. We can also respond via email after the presentation if we happen to run out of time.
Oh, how's everyone doing?
On that note, I will hand it over to our presenter.
Hi there, yeah, so again, my name is Nick Brittin, and I'm here at Lake Michigan College in Michigan, and this is my presentation on how to use Hawks, the Hawks courseware, specifically in Zooming courses, courses that are usually considered hybrid, although some schools have different terminology. So yeah, further on that point is it's easy enough to modify this type of lesson for a face-to-face course, but primarily here that's how I sort of conceived of it, was for a Zoom class. And so the students meet just basically like we are now. A lot of times I share the video too, so I can sort of have the presentation like this showing, but then I can also click back and show my face as well and see the students, see what their reactions are. The issue with that sometimes, just as a quick caveat, I don't know if you folks have taught that before, but if you haven't, it's better if the students have headsets, because for some reason they like to meet together in other locations, and there's tremendous feedback if they don't have some sort of headset. But it's hopefully those problems work themselves out. And what I like about this format is that it does allow us to combine some of the benefits of online education. A big concern of mine is that online courses sometimes turn into almost there's the risk that they become sort of like a correspondence course. The student submits work, you comment on it, they submit more work, you comment on it. There are some really neat benefits though, where they can say record the videos. You can record videos, they can record the discussions, they can rewatch them, they can key in on certain points. So if I were making a video for a class, say like a 101, I could have a paragraph a short video, maybe 5 minutes long, that focuses on developing theories, or that focuses on like a specific point of APA format, something like that, and they can just watch that. And maybe they get it the first time through, maybe they need to watch it 3 or 4 times. Face-to-face learning, once the lecture's over, you kind of have to go ask the instructor again. You have to review your notes and hope that you can kind of piece it back together. So that's nice. But then we do get that face-to-face of immediate questions, that sense of immediacy, where, hey, I have a question right now. Can we pause the video or rather pause the meeting and address that specific point? And then my classes do tend to use Hawks courseware, both for 101 and for 102. And there's some benefits to that too. One thing I like about that, I like several things, but the main thing here is that it allows the student, again, to spend extra time at home with the material. And then if before they take the test, that comes equipped with it. And if they know it right away, they can take the test pretty quickly and then move on to the next unit. Whereas if they need a little bit extra time, they need to go through it again, they have that opportunity. So it does really sort of personalize the experience and allows them to touch base with me face-to-face via the computer, when they need to. So it's pretty handy. And it's okay. So this objective for this particular video will be determining what questions are useful when reading for college. Because a lot of times my students are either coming directly from a K-12 environment, or a lot of them are actually enrolled in Michigan. We have what's called early middle college. I know a lot of states are moving to that. And so these would be high school aged students who, through part of their school day, are spending it here at the college, and the rest of the day they're spending at their high school. And the objectives in the K through 12 are very different. It seems like, not always, but some of them are coming from with that sort of test base, that SAT looming over their heads, just sort of producing the material. You were given information, memorize it, give it back. And that's something that I know that high school teachers resist, but there's sort of a system that's sort of aligned against them sometimes. And we want to make sure that they're reading on a collegiate level. And so these questions can help them do with research, when they look at the questions that when we're reading the text, what terms need defining. You know, a lot of times we think we know what terms, how the language everyone's speaking, but we kind of are maybe using the terms in slightly different ways. So determining how is the author using this particular terminology. They can also ask questions about like, what concepts do I not understand? Again, and I think about politics here, the politics of the day where people just sort of jump in and take a stand before they have a full conceptualization of what they're even arguing about. And so the students are dealing with that all day. They're getting bombarded with tweets and so on about this is how you should feel. And hopefully if they can learn this lesson about asking questions, then they can maybe resist that a little bit rather than just conforming. It also allows them to reflect on that. You do the research and then you can reflect and sort of put it together that, yeah, sure, I looked up the terms, I've read some articles about it. How do I actually feel about it? What do I actually conclude with that? Is it possible when I'm reading an essay maybe that I disagree with the author, maybe just naturally just come into it disagreeing with them? Am I open to the idea of the person changing my mind? Is this something where I can actually maybe learn or grow? And maybe not, maybe it's not useful. Maybe your original opinion is the right one, but maybe the author intended to change your mind one way and actually gave you a different idea. Who knows? And then even their own writing, the types of questions that they run into that maybe aren't just like inspiring questions, but maybe faults with the piece, faults with writing. How can they avoid doing that themselves? So if they practice looking at questions, what types of questions come up, they can take that experience in their own essay construction. And then even sort of maybe leaving some stuff open-ended so that the reader does continue thinking about it, does ask their own questions. So specifically what the activity does is they're going to read the homework before class starts. They're going to have read the chapter, and I say read the homework because the way that Hawks works is you're sort of reading and doing the homework at the same time, which I think is a really neat format. The thing about textbooks is they're very useful, they're great, but frankly they can only get so exciting. You know, so if you get a 20-page reading on, you know, essay construction theory or something like that, the average student's only going to find that so exhilarating. And if they have 20 pages by the end of like page 4, maybe, they aren't really paying that much attention to it, sort of looking at the words, but not really engaging. With Hawks, they read a page or two, and then they do an activity. And so that sort of forces them to sort of stay awake and stay doing it. So they'll come to class, they'll read the short essay, and we're going to have a question, an essay that we're going to sort of read as a class, sort of work together, either aloud or individually. It sort of depends on the format. And then we'll ask them to come up with questions, and then we'll show those questions, both mine and the students, to the entire class. And so we'll go through this. This is just sort of a basic overview. And then it encourages those things, the reflection, the research, demonstrates the limits of reading. Oops. So if we go to Hawks, I'm going to exit out of here and take a peek at precisely what Hawks is looking like. Here are the objectives for this particular chapter for 1.5. And so the first one is learn how to generate questions for discussion, learn how to recognize discussion in writing, so on and so forth, responding to those questions. If we go to page 5, this is the activity that we're specifically going to build off of. So once the Hawks is asking them to read this passage and then come up with some questions. And they'll type these questions in here. They'll have already done this. And so this is just to sort of get their feet wet, get them practicing. Some students are going to be particularly good at this, although that's not going to be the norm. This is actually, you know, I'm sure you guys are all aware that really pondering, doing these close readings is actually really hard sometimes. That we do want to, even as instructors, we sort of assume, well, I know what this essay is about. I know what the persons want me to do with this. And we sort of go through it maybe too quickly. And so really slowing down and saying, do I know what's going on here? Why do I think I know what's going on? What about me as a reader? How am I contributing to the meaning making of this particular piece? So it's a good exercise for us too, to really ponder it sentence by sentence and think about it. And so something like this that would probably take, say, a student a couple minutes to read and maybe an advanced reader maybe a minute, slowing down, spending 5 or 10 minutes on it, you know, really intensely focusing, asking those questions. The student, the first time they do it is probably, frankly, not going to be great. You know, they're probably going to do the basic, you know, junior high caliber kind of questions that aren't really going to be super useful until they have gone through. But they'll have done this once, and then we can go in and really get into it. And so we're here. When the essay I like to give them is from Stossel in the Classroom. And now John Stossel can be pretty controversial sometimes. He's very libertarian, often confused with right-wing. He's not precisely right-wing. His libertarians aren't exactly on that spectrum in the same way. But what I do like about this is that it's written by a student. You know, for him, students can submit essays to his classroom model, I guess, that he has. And you can submit essays, students can, and they win prizes. And then he'll feature some of these student essays. So the essay we read is actually student created. And I can't remember how much she got, like a certain prize money, something like that, for writing it. Another thing I like about it is that it presents a point of view that we don't often see. A lot of times folks, they read John Stossel's work and they don't agree with it. You know, right out of the gates, they say, look, I disagree with your perspective. Your point of view is just not correct. And so I like that the student's probably not going to immediately agree with it. And this particular piece, we'll look at it a little bit later on, is actually about why price gouging is good. After a natural disaster, price gouging is a good thing. And a lot of times people's gut reaction is to say, you know, wow, what kind of evil Mr. Burns from The Simpsons person would come up with that? There's no way a 17-year-old would think this way. The student actually does a pretty nice job. You might still leave the essay thinking, boy, I don't agree, but she makes some good points. It's worth certainly question generating for sure. So we'll review it. Let's take a quick peek at it here. So it comes up, and that's the wrong thing. So it's right here. So it says, let the market work its magic. And this is by, I'm not quite sure how to say her last name, but she's at age 17. And so throughout this article, we won't read the whole thing, but you can track it down. She argues that price gouging is good, that right after, say, a hurricane in Florida, that raising the prices actually is really helpful. And she mentions things like, because it sort of conserves goods, that people would come in and if, say, there's water, the person would buy all the water. The first person to come in would buy every bit of water they could afford, even if they didn't need it. And then the next person to come in doesn't have the opportunity to buy any water because they'd say that it's original price of $1 or $2 a bottle. So somebody has $100, they buy every bottle available. The next person comes in, can't get any. So she says, yeah, raise the price to where people can't hoard it, and then it can be more evenly dispersed throughout the community. And like I said, you may or may not agree with that, but it's actually, she does a nice job articulating it. And so students can get in here. Some of the questions they may have are, what exactly is price gouging? You know, it's a term we hear. It has negative connotations to it. But that doesn't mean just because we have a negative connotation doesn't mean we know the specific denotation of it. So it is worth looking that up and seeing exactly what do we mean. What counts as a natural disaster? That could be another one. Okay, hurricanes, I think we can safely say that's a natural disaster. But what about some sort of just shortage from something else? Maybe there's been a trucking shortage or something like that, and we can't get the water shipped fast enough. Does that count? What do we mean by that? And so I'm even getting into some of this other stuff. And the students generate some really interesting questions from it. And so you can take a look at this on your own. But it's a pretty neat article. And so give them a few minutes to read it. It's a pretty short essay. You know, this isn't going to take very long. We could either read it on our own or as a class, sometimes work our way through it. And then as questions go, have the students write those down. And then maybe post something like this. And I double paragraph my things. So this would be the activity. So I'd put this in discussions. And a lot of times what I do is I'm using Canvas as our learning management system. And it has a really handy discussions tab right there. And I could show you guys that. But it's just on the left, you'll see discussions. And so you post this in there, even in a face-to-face class, still put it in discussions. Because if you just say, okay, who has a question? You ask the class. If you're fortunate enough to have one of those classes where hands are going to go up in that situation, then that's great. You know, but sometimes students are going to say, look, I didn't realize this was for real. I didn't know that we were supposed to come up with really hard things today and understand stuff. So they're going to kind of be sheepish. If you put it on discussions, they're going to try harder because they're going to know that and let them know, hey, everybody in the room is going to see the questions you write down. So they're really going to try. They're going to try to outdo one another and say, well, look, I've got the best questions here. Do a nice job and really ponder before they put them out there. And then it also makes it easier to call on people. Instead of saying, okay, who wants to go, you can just pick somebody right off the discussions. You can just sort of scan through it and say, here's a good one. This is worth discussing right here, and bring it right up on the board. Like I said, I'm using Canvas. Blackboard has that capability too. It's just slightly different. Maybe the terminology is a little different. And so the things are, write 3 or 4 questions you would want to discuss / investigate so that you can either hold an intelligent conversation about this topic or write an academic essay about it. And I like this too because frankly, the students are not going to write a ton of academic essays in their life after school. Frankly, after they leave the English department, there's not a ton of essays anymore, depending on what subject they're in. They're going to write more than they think they are. But we're going to spend most of our time, writing other formats. We're going to spend our time conversing about things, yelling at the TV when we watch congressional hearings, those sorts of things. And so it's good to sort of have this relationship, stress that relationship that this is both both writing and speech, that this counts in both formats. And I say both formats actually in the many things that make up writing and the many things that make up conversation. And then they'll post the questions, and this is a link to the article right here. And so just in conclusion, the classroom experience is really changing quickly. As recently as I've been an educator now for a while. I'm thinking something 11 years actually, now that I think about it. Part-time at first, then I became full-time a few years ago. And even during that time, I've seen pretty massive changes. When I was even in grad school, there was learning management systems, but nobody really called them that. They were very clunky. Online education was basically that correspondence thing I mentioned earlier. And students are becoming very adept with it. And I think that as instructors, we need to sort of keep up with them as best we can. We're probably not going to be able to, at the pace of, say, a teenager in today's world, be able to really learn how to do functional discourse online, but we got to keep up. We've got to understand how these technologies work and know that the students' brains and learning experiences have changed too, the way they're looking at communication. And so using courseware like Hawks does allow the student to, maybe they do have somewhat shorter attention spans. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. I hear about that. I haven't exactly seen it demonstrated. But let's just assume for the sake of argument they do. Well, yeah, they're going to have a hard time getting through 20 pages of a dense textbook, but they can probably handle 3 or 4 minutes of a Hawks thing before an activity comes up. And then they get to read that paragraph, immediately post the questions. If that activity was at the end of a chapter, okay, refer back to page 17 or whatever, and write those questions. The student by that point has already lost interest. They're not going to be able to keep up with that. And frankly, I can't blame them. So these more engaging coursewares like Hawks are really nice. And then using things like Zoom, particularly paired up with a nice learning management system, if a student is maybe limited by transportation or they're limited by their schedule, it's amazing, especially these high school students who are taking college courses. They're in school, they're worrying about, even things that are maybe not super important in the long term, but to them, the big game is the big game. That is something that's going to eat up some sort of their processing power. They are going to focus on that. They are going to be thinking about boyfriends and girlfriends. And then plus all the really intense stuff that teenagers are faced with. It's a lot to ask of the kids these days. And even older students who maybe have families. Maybe they can't get away to attend an hour-and-a-half class, a 3-hour-long class, but they maybe could go in their bedroom or down the basement or something and log in to a Zoom setting for a hybrid class like this. And maybe they don't have to worry about getting a babysitter as much then. They can use that format to still have that meaningful contact with an instructor in a meaningful college situation. So those students who are maybe simply restricted by time and space can still get in touch with you like this. So that's kind of my very hurried presentation. It only took about 17 minutes. Should we open up to discussion to questions now, or I tend to move very quickly. My training is to get through these videos quickly so students can start doing stuff. So.
Yeah, absolutely. If any of the attendees have a question, please throw the questions in the question and answer box. I had a question.
Sure.
How do you handle, you see so much toxicity online,
mm-hmm.
And, you are in a classroom and people are using their names, but do you ever have to handle controversy or people not respecting each other's opinions when you're doing some of these activities?
I've more heard of it than actually had to engage with it. I'm very fortunate in that my students come in, I have a fairly disciplined environment I'm teaching in. And so what I let students know, a lot of times I give them like a list at the beginning of the semester and say, look, these are some of the things we're going to talk about. These are the things that are going to come up. I've recently added a new unit and I haven't had a chance to test it out, but we're going to actually be doing this in my Composition 101 this in about a month, where we're going to use a TED Talk video where a guy who used to be a neo-Nazi and he opened up this white supremacist CD store. This was back back when we still had CDs, and he was selling this white power music to neo-Nazis, and he sort of got out of it, because he started. Other people were coming in. He couldn't say, hey, this is, Hitler's CD store. So people were coming in sort of on accident, and he was meeting them. And at first he hated them. And then he started finding out that, these people who are different from him were actually humans too. And they had valuable experiences. And so he gets out of it. And now his goal is to talk to other neo-Nazis and sort of bring them out of it, get them out of there. when you bring up neo-Nazis, even though it has what I would consider a very happy ending, the guy leaves that behind, makes new friends, helps the world out, it's going to bring up some pretty dark terms. We're going to probably go to some neo-Nazi websites, like National Alliance websites, and say, look at how these people are using rhetoric. Look at how be aware that these folks, they would get an A in this class. They are good at this stuff. They know how to use language effectively. And so we're going to look at what they have to say, and I'll just warn the students, this is an adult world you're entering into. And these are the people who are going to have serious disagreements with you. Most students are going to say, hey, I agree, Nazis are bad. They're not going to be Nazi sympathizers in my classes. Where it could become problematic is if we bring up issues of, say, prayer in schools comes up sometimes. I live in an area that does have a fairly strong evangelical community, and so sometimes those students are going to be, maybe more on that spectrum and say, look, we shouldn't talk so much about evolution. I tell them, look, you don't have, that's not what we're dealing with here. I'm going to bring it up sometimes. You don't have to believe me. That's not the discussion for this course, but just be aware it informs what I do. I think with politics, students are, at least the students I run into, are fairly willing to compromise. I'm willing to accept that, look, maybe I'm a Democrat and he's a Republican or vice versa or whatever it is. And we just let them know you have to be respectful, but also thick-skinned. If somebody made an honest mistake and they said something incorrectly, then let's have a conversation. Let's not yell at them. That maybe they just didn't understand yet. Give them an opportunity to learn rather than really come down on them. I hope that helps out. That's kind of my long-winded answer.
That's great to hear that you are having that civil engagement with your students. I have one other question.
Sure.
In that, what sort of response do you hear back from students? You talked about breaking how Hawks breaks it up into some different segments that makes it short, that keeps their attention. Do you get feedback from students on maybe they have done it differently and are able to engage with it more this way, or they digest the content better, or they react to it in a different way because it doesn't feel overwhelming?
Sure. One thing is, I think the students, they seem to prefer, at least my students, I asked the class, because we're running a traditional textbook as well in that course, and I'm about to drop that one. I won't tell you what it is, but it's a solid book that has some good pieces in it. But I asked the students, what do you prefer, the Hawks or the traditional book? And it was a class of, I believe, 18 students, and 16 preferred Hawks. I think that, frankly, they find it's easier. And one thing that I like, another thing I like about it is that it does give you some of those nuts and bolts questions that maybe aren't super thrilling to talk about in class, where you do get some of the stuff where it's the technical things, the punctuation, the grammar, that we feel like students should know by the time they get to college, but what if they don't? We don't want to spend an hour talking about how commas work. We don't want to spend a ton of time. You can only make APA discussions so exciting. So have the students learn some of those nuts and bolts, maybe when they're more awake. I teach classes at 8 in the morning, and I can't imagine sitting there listening to me talk for an hour and a half about how independent clauses function with semicolons and so on. So I maybe give them a brief discussion about it and then say, look, you can go learn this. If you have questions, feel free to bring it back, to class, no problem. And then they have to go through the exercises until they get it. Whereas with a textbook, if there's something they run into that they don't understand, the temptation will be, well, I feel like I should know that. I'm not going to bring it up because I don't want to be that guy. I'm not going to make a mistake in front of everybody, so I'll just pretend I got it and I'll move on. I'll sort of skip that. Hawks doesn't let you do that. You have to do it until you get it. You have to keep going at it. And luckily, you make those mistakes when nobody's watching. You get to make those mistakes at home. Nobody's looking at you saying, what do you mean you don't know? You have a tendency to write comma splices. Boy, you don't have to make those mistakes in front of people. And I don't think people would pick on each other, but just in case if there's that worry. So students seem to, like I say, 16 of 18 preferred Hawks. I did have 2 who said, no, I prefer the original book, the traditional book, just because I think they're used to it. That it was a new thing for them. And I think that give another 5 or 10 years, and it would probably be closer to maybe even all 18 would have said, as things like this emerge, I think students will get more comfortable with it.
Wonderful. Okay, well, if any more questions do come in, please direct them to our email at marketing@hawkslearning.com, and we'll compile them for Professor Brittin. Professor Brittin, I want to thank you for all of the information and for all our attendees for joining us today for the webinar. We will be emailing out a link to view this webinar on demand shortly. and you can view this webinar as well as past and future webinars on our blog at blog.hawkslearning.com. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Great. Thank you for hosting me. Thanks.